Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Jonathan Reynolds.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I've been asked to reply on behalf of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, who is visiting Turkey and Auschwitz. This morning, Mr. Speaker, I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in the House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Jonathan Reynolds.
The Deputy Prime Minister last week refused to attend the autumn statement. Can he tell the House exactly which parts of that statement he most objected to?
That autumn statement was a coalition autumn statement. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I spent one day in Cornwall. Members opposite have been spending 5 years in cloud cuckoo land when it comes to the economy, because this side of the House has been clearing up the mess that they created.
Peter Lilly.
In the light of my right honourable friend's enthusiasm for devolving powers from UK government to component members of parts of the United Kingdom, does he have similar plans for devolving competencies from Europe to UK institutions?
Mr. Speaker, he will be perhaps surprised to know I even once wrote a little booklet about that very idea, that just as we have to decide to do certain things at European level together that nation-states can't do on their own, the environment, globalisation, trade talks and so on, there are certain other powers which, of course, where possible, should be devolved downwards as well.
Harriet Harman.
Well, it's good to see the Deputy Prime Minister back in his place after his important day trip during the important statement. But, Mr. Speaker, since he became Deputy Prime Minister, he's had the opportunity to appoint 7 cabinet members. Can he remind the House how many of them have been women?
Mr. Speaker, she knows exactly who the members of the cabinet are and of the Liberal Democrat team. But I would like to remind her that for the millions of women in this country, they have got from this government something they never got from her government. Better pensions, more jobs, tax cuts, shared parental leave, better childcare, more flexible working. Instead of scoring Westminster points, why doesn't she do the right thing for millions of women around the country?
To answer the question, which is unlike him, because normally when he's asked about numbers and women, he's quite forthcoming. But this is not. Let me tell the House. Let me tell the House. The answer to the question: 4.5 years as Deputy Prime Minister, 7 cabinet appointments, not 1 woman. And this is not a Westminster point. It affects what they do. So let me ask him. Since his government brought in tribunal fees, what has been the fall in the number of sex discrimination cases?
Mr. Speaker, I don't have that statistic to hand. Of course, I will. Of course, I'm very happy to provide it to her. But, Mr. Speaker, you know, once again, she displays the way in which her and her party are in total denial about their own record when it came to women in our country. Female unemployment rose 24% under Labour. Under Labour, in 1 year, women were given a paltry 75p rise in the state pension. Scandalous, a total shame. Through our new fairer single-tier pension, 650,000 women will get an extra £400 a year from 2016. And I care more about those 650,000 women across the country than I do about anyone round the cabinet table.
I'll answer the question, since he hasn't. Since the introduction of their tribunal fees, there has been a 90% fall in women taking sex discrimination cases, including women who've been discriminated against at work because they're pregnant. Let me turn to another of his key decisions. Of those who get the millionaire's tax cut, what percentage are men?
It's quite breathtaking. It's quite breathtaking. This is she not aware that over 26 million people who've benefited from our tax cuts for low and middle income earners, that tax cut has disproportionately gone to women? Is she not aware that under her government the top rate of tax was 40p, 5p lower than it is under this government? Is she not aware that there are now more women in employment than ever before? That is a record of which we are very proud indeed.
And he should be aware that any gains on tax changes for women have been more than wiped out by the hit they've taken on the cuts to tax credit. And yes, indeed, I would agree with him. It is breathtaking. Let me tell the House, 85% of those who benefit from the millionaire's tax cut are men. So let's try him on another one. What proportion of those hit by his bedroom tax are women?
Speaker, since she's losing her way a bit with statistics, let me tell you, we have cut tax for 11.9 million women. The gender pay gap for women under the age of 40 has pretty well disappeared under this coalition. Under her government, only 1 in 8 of the FTSE 100 board members were women. Under this government, there are more women on FTSE 100 boards than ever before. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party is becoming the sort of Lance Armstrong of British politics. They've just forgotten the better half of a decade of how they messed things up.
Well, I'll tell the Deputy Prime Minister in the House the reality for people who are paying the bedroom tax. 2/3 of those hit by the bedroom tax are women. Doesn't seem there's any shortage of spare rooms in Downing Street for the spin doctors to spin against each other, though. But let me ask him about something else. Of the £26 billion this government has raised in changes to benefits and direct taxes, a staggering £22 billion of that has come from women. Can he explain why?
Speaker, I think it is time to call out the Right Honourable Lady on her government's record. Under Labour, unemployment was higher. Female unemployment was higher. Youth unemployment was higher. Inequality was higher. Child poverty was higher. Pensioner poverty was higher. Relative poverty was higher. Fuel poverty was higher. And income tax for low and middle income earners, including millions of women, was higher. When will she come to admit that her party created so much of the mess that this side of the House has had to clear up since?
That he is completely out of touch with women's lives. And it's always the same with this Deputy Prime Minister. He talks the talk, but he walks through the lobby with the Tories. He briefs against them, but he always votes with them. He complains about the autumn statement, but he signed it off. And that's why people will never trust him or his party ever again.
Mr. Speaker, does she seriously think the British people are going to trust her and her party on the economy? Of course not. Manufacturing jobs were destroyed 3 times faster under them than it was under Margaret Thatcher. This was the party that, in fact, the Shadow Health Secretary sitting there demurely is the only man in England who's ever privatised an NHS hospital. And they dare to lecture us, Hitchingbrook Hospital, the only NHS hospital privatised by the Labour Party. Inequality higher under Labour, privatisation of the NHS higher under Labour, and an economy destroyed under Labour.
Mr. Stephen Hammond.
My constituents in Wimbledon would have been delighted to hear the Deputy Prime Minister's support for the excellent autumn statement last week, because people in Wimbledon know it's the only credible plan for economic recovery. They have been worried because there have been some scurrilous rumours abound that the Deputy Prime Minister wanted to raise taxes and put a homes tax on in the next Parliament. After his answer to question 1, that can't be true. So would he today confirm his loyalty to the long-term economic plan, which is bringing jobs and growth to people in Wimbledon?
Mr. Speaker, I of course, wholeheartedly agree with him that we must stay the course in order to finish the job and finish it fairly. He perhaps will know that the long-term youth claimant count in his constituency has fallen just in the last year by a full 40%. That is an extraordinary achievement. As he knows, my view is that it is simply not fair or justifiable to apply property tax bans, council tax bans, to lower value properties and not adopt the same approach to higher value properties. Why should a family living in a family home in Lewisham pay the same council tax as someone living in a £10 million palace, possibly in Wimbledon? Doesn't make sense to me, and it should change.
Julie Hilling.
Mr. Speaker, my 69-year-old Atherton constituent Margaret was run over by a car and was left bleeding in the road for 90 minutes before the ambulance turned up. The Chancellor last week said the government has made cuts without affecting frontline services. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree, or does he regret supporting every cut that this government has made?
Mr. Speaker, what I regret enormously is that every household in her constituency, indeed every household in all of our constituencies, took a hit of £3,000 each because of the crash in 2008, caused in large part by the absolute neglect of the Labour Party in government not to. That's what I regret. That's what I regret. That's what I regret. This economy has suffered a cardiac arrest, the likes of which we have not seen in the post-war period. And I'm very proud of the fact that this coalition government is taking the painstaking, if controversial, decisions to make sure that we live within our means and don't simply burden our children and our grandchildren with this generation's mistakes.
Charlie Elphick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Dover and Deal are very concerned by border security and the situation that we've seen in Calais this year. Does he agree that while we've acted, the European Union needs to take more responsibility for people trafficking, for the problems of Schengen open borders, and to get Italy to take responsibility as first country for asylum claimants at the Isle of Lampedusa?
Mr. Speaker, I certainly, of course, I can understand what an important issue this is for him and his constituents, and I certainly agree with him that this is a problem shared, and therefore the solution needs to be shared as well across the European Union. It's one of the reasons why I've always been an advocate of cross-border cooperation in the European Union on issues which have to do with people crossing our borders. We can't do that on our own, and I agree with him that wherever possible the European Union should act effectively and together.
Gordon Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we've called for a Section 30 order to fast-track elements of the Smith Commission to Scotland, especially vote for 16 and 17-year-olds in the 2016 Scottish Parliament election. Now, I know his boss never usually allows him to make the big decisions, but seeing he's in the big seat today, will he make a commitment to go ahead with these Section 30 orders now?
Mr. Speaker, we will stick to the timetable that was committed to by all the main parties in Westminster at the time of the referendum, and we've religiously stuck to that timetable so far. And in fact, despite predictions by the SNP, we have over-delivered on the commitments about further devolution to Scotland, despite their predictions to the contrary. As he knows, there is a lively debate about the franchise for 16 and 17-year-olds. My party has always believed that we should give 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote. They took up that right with alacrity in the Scottish referendum, but it's clearly something which will continue to be debated across parties in this House.
Mr. Michael Thornton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A bit surprised. Some of the most heart-rending cases I see in my surgery.
One was standing, so presumably he was standing hoping for the call. So surprised.
Sometimes I worry I might forget where I am. Anyway, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Thank you. Some of the most heart-rending cases in my surgery on a weekly basis are those people who have had mental health difficulties and feel let down by the National Health and other organisations set to help them. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that it's time we did more?
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, I suspect many members across all parties in this House will agree that mental health services for too long have been treated as a sort of poor cousin, as a Cinderella service in the NHS, have been systematically underfunded for a long period of time, and that's why I'm delighted to say that we have announced as a coalition government that we will be introducing new access and waiting time standards for mental health conditions in a way that have been in existence for physical health conditions for a long period of time. And over time, as reflected in the new NHS mandate, we must ensure that mental health is treated with the same equality of resources and esteem in the NHS just as much as any other part of the NHS.
When the Health and Social Care Act passed through Parliament, the government said it wasn't about privatisation. A recent study by the British Medical Journal says that 1/3 of all contracts has gone to the private sector and only 10% to the voluntary and social enterprise sector. Does the Deputy Prime Minister regret supporting the legislation?
Mr. Speaker, he's being highly selective in describing what that report said. What it actually said was that of all NHS budget contracts, 6% have gone to the private sector. Guess how high it was when this government took office? 5%. So they presided over a 5% delivery of contracts to the private sector. We've added 1% on it. They delivered £250 million worth of sweetheart deals to the NHS, deliberately undercutting the NHS for operations which didn't help a single NHS patient in the country, and they have the gall to lecture this side of the House on the privatisation of the NHS.
Duncan! Will the Deputy Prime Minister unreservedly condemn what appears to be the killing this morning by the Israeli Defence Force of the Palestinian government minister, Ziad Abu Ain, who is doing nothing more than protesting in his own country against illegal demolitions and the destruction of ancient olive groves by the State of Israel? Will Her Majesty's government join international pressure in demanding a full investigation and then calling, should it be so justified, for the prosecution of the soldier who struck him?
Mr. Speaker, of course, I and the government will look with urgency into the circumstances around this killing. And of course, we condemn all unwarranted acts of violence on all sides in the Middle East. The circumstances of this particular death is something I'm not familiar with now. Clearly, we want to see restraint exercised on all sides. We want to see an end to illegal settlement activity, an end to indiscriminate violence being inflicted on innocent Israeli citizens, and a demonstrative move on all sides, which will involve compromises and difficult compromises towards the two-state solution, which is the only means by which peace and security can be delivered to all communities in the Middle East.
The Deputy Prime Minister has received donations totalling £34,500 from the Managing Director of Autofill Yarns Limited. Can he tell the House what he thinks of the fact that workers at Autofill Yarns Limited have received the news recently that as many as 160 jobs could be moved overseas, jobs lost to Britain by Autofill Yarns?
Mr. Speaker, clearly I can't speak for Autofill, and any company needs to explain its own business and investment decisions. I'm very, very surprised by his line of questioning, given that the Labour Party is entirely bankrolled by the puppet masters of the trade unions. For all I know, that question might have been written for him by his trade union bosses, and surely he would agree with me that it is time that we clean up party funding on a cross-party basis once and for all.
Mr. Stuart Jackson.
In Peterborough, youth unemployment has halved since 2010. Apprenticeships are at record level, and the JSA claimant count is down 51% in the last 4 years. In addition, the number of children living in work-class households is now at a record low nationally. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that such achievements and the policies that gave rise to them, consistently opposed by the Labour Party, show political courage and will change the lives of people for the better, and not, as some people have foolishly said, as a result of an ideological commitment to austerity?
Mr. Speaker, I think it is very striking that, given that at the outset of this coalition government we were told by the party opposite that 3 million people would be unemployed, that we now find that there are more people in work than ever before. I find it striking in my constituency, as he no doubt does in his. I remember being warned by the Right Honourable Member for Brightside. He said, quotes, "There'll be a post-Soviet meltdown, people will be fending for themselves on the streets. We now have fewer young people who are not in education, employment or training in Sheffield ever. Fewer NEETs in that great city than ever." And that is something you see repeated across the country, and that was because of a balanced, pragmatic, non-ideological approach to balancing the books steadily over time.
Geoffrey Robinson.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Deputy Prime Minister to use his evidently widespread support in the coalition ranks opposite, and in particular with the Prime Minister, to prevail on the Prime Minister to honour a pledge he gave in June this year to the victims of the contaminated blood scandal that took place in the NHS. It's a scandal that reflects very badly on successive administrations, since administration probably of as far back as Harold Wilson and before, and it is something he undertook to look at and rectify to the extent possible in June. It would be one pledge, one promise the coalition government has it in their power to deliver.
I'm grateful to him for his question, because he's quite right, of course, that this is a heart-wrenching issue which has dragged on now for a very, very long period of time. If I may, I will write to him, as I know that steps have been taken seeking to address some of the many and legitimate outstanding claims which exist, and I will look into it for him and write to him if I may.
Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Deputy Prime Minister will be aware that Sherwood Forest Hospital Trust currently stands in special measures. What assistance can he give to the Health Secretary as he works with the Trust to continue improvements, despite them wrestling with their £40 million a year repayments to a PFI deal signed under the previous government?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid it's another example of the Janus-faced approach to the NHS from the party opposite. They entered into this appalling PFI contract along with other PFI contracts to the NHS, which are now costing the NHS £1 billion a year. And it's an absolute scandal that the Sherwood Forest Hospitals Trust is being crippled by the botched PFI entered into by the previous government. The Sherwood Forest Hospitals Trust is now receiving central support to address its underlying financial deficit and has developed a plan showing year-on-year improvements in this position, including 145 extra nurses, nursing support staff and doctors since going into special measures.
Toby Perkin.
If the Deputy Prime Minister had attended the autumn statement, he would have heard the Chancellor claim that this was a government that backed small business. Now, he could give those words some meaning by backing Labour's plan to outlaw large companies, to outlaw large companies who are charging small companies to be on their supplier list. Will he take this opportunity within the small business bill to actually back that plan and really start standing up for small firms?
Well, thankfully, we've seen more new and small businesses being created under this coalition government than has been the case since records began. I actually agree with him, and I think everyone would agree with him, that some of the revelations that have come to light in recent days of some large companies, particularly in the food sector, in effect charging small suppliers for the privilege of providing them with supplies in the first place, is something which I know my Right Honourable Secretary of State for Business has looked at and is looking at very carefully, and I know he's already pledged publicly he will take action if necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Diane Howells, my constituent, visited GPs in Newark 15 times in 8 months last year, before she was eventually diagnosed with terminal cancer when her son Luke took her to A&E in Newark. 80,000 people a year, or 1/4 of all new cancer cases, are only diagnosed at A&E. Would my right honourable friend agree to review this very tragic case, and also to back Luke's campaign that cancer be ruled out first and not last, and increase referral rates at our GPs?
Mr. Speaker, of course I will look into the case, and I'm sure my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, will be keen to look at it as well himself and get back to him. As he knows, the NHS is successfully seeing 51% more patients with suspected cancers than 4 years ago. Survival rates have never been higher. Almost 9 out of 10 patients say their care is excellent or very good, and of course the Cancer Treatment Fund has helped thousands upon thousands of patients. But of course, where possible, we should always do more.
Greg McClymont.
The Deputy Prime Minister has made a series of extraordinary claims today, but among the most extraordinary is his claim in response to the Honourable Lady's question that pensioner poverty rose under the last government. In fact, pensioner poverty fell dramatically. So can the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, explain to the House what his source for that claim is? It certainly can't be the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which in 2010 reported that pensioner poverty fell dramatically under the last government.
Well, the source of it is that it's a whole lot better what we're doing than the insult of 75p. 75p. We have delivered the largest cash increase in the state pension ever. We have delivered the triple lock guarantee for pensioners. We want to put that into law so that, unlike pensioners under Labour, pensioners on the state pension, because of this coalition government, will know that their state pension will go up by a decent amount every single time. That's my source.
Closed question, Dr. Julian Lewis.
Number 12, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, our defence budget is the biggest in the EU and the second largest in NATO. This government is spending 2% of GDP on defence this Parliament, one of only 4 NATO countries to do so.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
That wasn't exactly an answer to the question on the order paper. Given that this country, for decades, spent more than 4% on defence, would the Deputy Prime Minister not agree that it would be a disgraceful dereliction of duty if the British government ever fell below the 2% minimum recommended by NATO?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend will know, we're spending 2% of GDP on defence and have consistently met and exceeded this NATO guideline. We're spending over £160 billion on equipment and equipment support over the next 10 years, which will ensure we have one of the best trained and best equipped armed forces in the world. Decisions, of course, on defence spending after 2015-16 will have to be determined in the next comprehensive spending round.
Ben Bradshaw.
What does he think of the fact that under his government, if he now needed an operation in Devon, he'd be denied it because he smokes, as would the Communities Secretary because of his size?
It's a bit harsh. It's a bit harsh. Mr. Speaker, I don't think anyone would disagree with clinicians in Devon and elsewhere urging patients to look after themselves and prepare themselves for operations. My understanding is that the decision or the announcement mooted in Devon is about patients preparing themselves for operations. But of course, I disagree with the idea of, in effect, rationing in this way, and that is one of the reasons why we have announced, in total, £3 billion of extra money for our beloved NHS.
Ian Swales.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 30th of November, the people of Switzerland voted overwhelmingly to retain freedom of movement with the European Union because their politicians talked about the economic benefits of being in the single market. Will the Deputy Prime Minister continue to do what the City, the CBI and companies in my constituency want, talk about those benefits for the UK and reject the politics where we know the cost of everything and the value of nothing?
Mr. Speaker, I strongly agree with him that freedom of movement, which is, by the way, a privilege and entitlement that over 1.5 million British citizens benefit from across the European Union now, is something that we should defend. But freedom of movement is not the same and is not synonymous with the freedom to claim, which is why there is now a very healthy debate about how we ensure that freedom of movement can be protected whilst the rules surrounding access to benefits can be changed.
Question 14, closed question, Mr. Graham Allen.
14, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman and the committee he chairs for their work on the operation of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. Fixed Term Parliaments give greater predictability and continuity, enabling better long-term legislative and financial planning. The full effect of introducing Fixed Term Parliaments is something which can only be assessed, of course, over time, which is why the Act will be reviewed in 2020.
Graham Allen.
Nearly 25 years ago, I asked the then Prime Minister, Mrs Thatcher, at PMQs, if she'd set up a national institution to reduce the sexual abuse of children. May I congratulate the Deputy Prime Minister and his government on setting up over the last 5 years a series of what works organisations to provide best practice, including early intervention. But may I ask if he and other party leaders will now consider putting in their manifestos the creation of a national institute for the study and prevention of sexual abuse of children, so we don't have another 25 years worth of belated inquiries, but preempt perpetration and help victims with the best evidence-based practice and programmes, both nationally and internationally.
Mr. Speaker, I happen to know that he's seeing my right honourable friend, the Minister for Crime Prevention, on this issue next week, and I actually agree with him, and my party does, on the merits of What Works initiatives. We believe that a What Works Institute for Crime Prevention would be a good idea, and of course he shines a spotlight on the reprehensible, grotesque crimes of child sex abuse and exploitation, and I agree with him, we need to work together, which is why the National Group to Tackle Sexual Violence Against Children and Vulnerable People has been set up to work together across agencies, across areas, across local authorities to bear down on these reprehensible crimes.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last weekend, I had the pleasure of visiting a local primary school in my constituency, Mottcombe. They have moved tooth and nail to introduce free school meals really very successfully. Will the Deputy Prime Minister take this opportunity to congratulate Mottcombe, all the primary schools of my constituency and across England who have done such a fantastic job delivering on his policy?
Mr. Speaker, of course I'd like to congratulate everybody at Mottcombe Primary School and primary schools across the country who have, despite all the scepticism and all the cynicism to the contrary, delivered healthy, free school meals at lunchtime to hundreds of thousands, in fact 1.5 million more children. The benefits of doing so, the educational benefits and the health benefits, are very considerable, and I'm delighted we're now doing this across the country.
To you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Deputy Prime Minister tell us why, with crude oil at below $70, that price is not reflected at the pumps?
Mr. Speaker, I know that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary of the Treasury have raised this with the industry because we all want to see lower shifts in oil prices across the world reflected in lower prices in our forecourts, and that is something that we must continue to focus on in our dealings with all of the oil companies.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, we should be clear. It is not wrong to express concern about the scale of people coming into this country. People have understandably become frustrated. It boils down to one word: control. Does the stand-in Prime Minister agree with the Prime Minister? Because those were his words.
Mr. Speaker, I think there are some important controls that we do need to improve and strengthen. So that is why, for instance, I believe it is essential that we reintroduce the proper border controls, the exit checks that used to exist on our borders, that were removed by previous governments. It's something that I insisted was in the coalition agreement myself. We're now on track to do that, so that just as we count people in, we count them out as well. And that is so important, those additional controls, because then we can discover who has overstayed their visa, which is one of the biggest problems of people overstaying their presence here in the United Kingdom illegally.
Order.